Well, good evening to the Mirador Round Table. Very diverse and excellent group of people this evening for our discussion. And I was reminded when we looked at the topic for tonight of the novel and the film The Mouse That Roared, where the Duchy of Grand Fenwick invades the United States so that he can get help on the Marshall Plan, and actually ends up winning the invasion, but comes back with an atomic scientist. And since we're now reading about Star Wars again, after some years, and tensions between the major powers, are we in danger of tipping into any sort of conflagration? Well, are we going to go to war is the question. And Stephen, let's come to you first.
I'm not an expert on war.
That's good. We need amateurism.
Oh, we certainly have that at the helm of the military and the Air Force and the Navy at the moment. Stacked full of amateurs is number 10. I think it's possible. China seems upset and depressed that we're not all buying its tinware and its 5G system. And spurred on by America, I think that decision was taken. You know, we're perhaps in a position of being America's puppet without having the EU to speak for us anymore. So I think if the president presently running America is still in charge after November, some form of attack is quite likely. And I worry about it because we are in no position to defend ourselves with the various cuts and underinvestment that have been made in our armed forces over the past 15 to 20 years. And I rather fear that we may be sent in first by the commander-in-chief in the White House. That's how I see it. Naive, you may think, but then it doesn't do to overthink these situations, does it?
Paul, an economic war, a cyber war, or will somebody push a button?
Any one of 33 different alternatives. I was born, I was 9 rather, at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. My father was a major in the army, and I've never seen a population so terrified. The only reason that that was resolved was that you had a very firm Kennedy dealing with a pragmatic Khrushchev. Had Khrushchev not backed down, we would have had a nuclear war. Now, I don't think we've progressed in the last 60 years. My fear is that in those days you had Russia and America who dominated. Now you have, think about it, 7 or 8, 9 nuclear warheads, nuclear missiles. You've got Pakistan armed. It's surely much more difficult to negotiate now, whether you're Trump, whether you're Xi Jinping, the Chinese premier. So to me, Enni's question is absolutely relevant because it's more on us now, because you might get smiles from Trump and North Korean leader, but actually we the public know nothing about it. I mean, it all came out after the Cuban Missile Crisis. What's going on, nobody knows, and that's dangerous.
We missed your last couple of words there. It's a pity we don't have any representation from the United States this evening. But Mark, every movie that we ever see is the US military seems to have huge power over the civil government. Do you think that that's a fair reflection? And if so, what is the worry that some general will push a button because he wants to play with his toys?
In the US, I have to admit, I think it's actually fairly unlikely. I think that the American army really does march to the tune of the politicians rather than the other way around. Maybe they are sensible enough to be to provide sensible voices at the upper end, but within that, maybe they're 1 or 2 hawks. But I don't think that they would launch into a war on their own. But then I'm a great believer in the goodness of humanity, and I think that there would probably be people that will step in to prevent a lone individual creating a problem.
Well, let me follow up with you then, because for a while it was China, ourselves, and the United States, and then the Star Wars satellite went up from Russia the other day. What role are they going to play? Have we got now more players who are going to be bellicose, or is there some way of balancing?
I suspect, actually, at the level of that we're talking about, these major players, I think at the very most you won't get anything more than a little bit of shoving and pushing, a bit of tit for tat, in order to lay down the lines for future negotiations and determining the path for trade and relationships. So what you'll see is just a bit of shoving and so, you slap me, I'll slap you back, but not more than a tiny shove. I think that the greater risks of violence come from the players that are managing to or pursuing the types of weapons that can do significant damage and that are not tied to a long-term relationship. So the slightly rogue states that are creating nuclear bombs, and you don't actually need a full-on nuclear weapon to do a lot of damage. You just need a dirty bomb that could leave an area devastated for a generation. So a device left in a city could actually do far more harm by leaving it radioactive and nobody wanting to go there than a full-on nuclear weapon. And those are the people that I think we do need to worry about. And I think all of those major players need to worry about that. And maybe that's one of the things that will keep them together. So above the table, they might jostle a little bit, but underneath, I'm sure they will find a way of compromising. But then I admit there again.
The other day that you were rather concerned by the news and it depressed you. Now that you've heard your fellow panelists, you feel any better or any worse?
As you may have guessed, gentlemen, I really don't have any knowledge about politics. I listen to the news, and yes, as the small person in the population, we don't know exactly what's going on, do we? All we know is what the news tell us. What we hear is not very good, I don't think. Are we going to have another NHS situation with all the cuts to the armed forces? If there's an issue, are we going to have to scramble for funds again for the armed forces? What is going to happen? And I don't even know if something is going to happen between China, US and the UK. I'm not even sure that Trump will be our ally. After all, he may just change his mind.
Well, you're quite right. Politics makes many strange bedfellows. But you just heard what Mark said, and his belief is that if we have any problem at all, it really won't come from the international scene. Does that make you feel any easier?
Not sure.
It's a good job I can't see his face at the moment. Stephen, you've heard the views of your fellow panelists. Is there anything that triggers, excuse the expression, triggers any thoughts in your mind, or do you think that they've basically underscored what you had to say in the first instance?
Well, I'm sure Mark speaks with greater authority than the rest of us, and I listen carefully to what he says. But Annie makes the very good point that Trump can change his mind several times in 30 seconds. And if one can interpret what he is saying, one really has quite a gift. Johnson too seems not to know exactly what he says, and what he says is not always what happens. But I think Johnson is very far from controlling anything that will happen on an international scale. It really does depend what he is told to do by his special advisor, who of course spent 15 years living quite well in Mother Russia. And
Paul, sorry, Stephen.
No,
Paul,
no, please.
You just heard what Stephen has to say, and I always rely upon you looking at things from the financial point of view, and I don't think we should ever underestimate the power of finance. I mean, I don't think that people understand when we talk about the City of London, that probably more money sloshes through the City of London in one day than does in many smaller economies in a year.
Yeah, well, can I just do the important point which I'd like to add to the excellent talks that my fellow panelists have done is, firstly, I agree with Mark. The major powers, China, etc., will posture, no doubt about that. The worry is that it's the poorer, the terrorist-orientated nations who might get these arms. That's just as big a worry as somebody launching a missile from China. So that's often forgotten. There's no doubt Pakistan has got some nuclear weapons, etc. So it's really uncontrollable. Financially, Keith, yeah, I think Annie and everyone else is right, is the fact that we are really, I suppose, the US's poodle, the US's puppet, and we would side with them generally in any conflagration and hope that they would probably help us armament-wise, etc. That's not a great, as I say, you've got some pretty cavalier presidents and premiers around, but I can't see any other way that we couldn't follow, unless Trump was totally off his mind. We'd have to go along with what America decided, I think. But let's face it, I think the likes of Trump, Putin, Xi Jinping, etc., Boris, they do meet quite often on this. I'm not saying they're friends, but remember, after the Second World War, you had Stalin was hated by Churchill and vice versa. But the three of them worked together for a common cause, yes? Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt. So they all had different backgrounds, but they won the war. So I would argue that if there are lots of nutters around, I think as Mark said, they're probably outnumbered by the people who are decent. And so I'm not as worried as probably some people are. But economically, Keith, it'll be a nightmare. Worse than if we had to participate in any war, etc., any prospering, then what would it do to economies? Correct?
Well, I've just had a warning that my battery is getting low and I can't see the lead. So if I go black, if nobody has dropped the bomb, it's just one of those simple things. I've got to find a plug. Stephen.
Well, I just wanted to say that, or ask really, which country is busy supplying arms to many terrorist countries? Why? The disunited kingdom, of course. Our arms industry is really doing quite well. We could, of course, be arming the enemy, could we not?
Indeed, we could.
That won't stop this government from doing what it does to get its hands on the money. I'm still convinced that old age pensioners are being sacrificed to use their pensions to fill other gaps.
Stephen, it's not just this country; it's other countries, Saudi Arabia, America. Let's face it. Yeah, as Keith said, economically, it's going on. We know Mark Thatcher was caught up in the arms situation.
Yes, yes.
So there's a good lad for you. So I don't think it's just Britain. I think
his mother thought highly of him.
Yes.
Okay, chaps. Let's not get involved in sort of a breakout. Mark, what's your view?
So on our risk, I think, from the point of view of war, I'm actually, I think that the greater risk are things that we don't actually see in more material ways. It'll be economic outflanking and probably cyber war. I think that's a greater risk to all of us. And maybe a long-term seeding of different types of ideology as well. So if you're looking at people that are trying to change what's going on, the head-on rush towards warfare is no longer really the way to do it. It's a long game where seeding a different set of ideas infiltrating into a nation and changing their attitudes and approaches over a long period, then more likely to be the risk that we have to watch out for.
As somebody who can't even change his password, what sort of effects would cyber attacks? Because I read about them all the time, but I must say that they don't have great impact because at my age, over 35, because I don't understand computers very well. What sort of impact would you think that cyber attacks would have?
Well, there'll be various levels that it'll be approached on. I think that there'll be a testing constantly of the resilience of the system, trying to identify where the weaknesses are. So, for instance, into this country, you've got a few main cables where all of the internet comes in from around the world. If you can find ways of blocking those, then you start to create a huge economic impact for that country, if you can take control over that. And I think that this country is rightly finding ways of creating resilience.
Eddie, you use a computer on a daily basis for all sorts of various things. I remember there was this big fear that when we turned the century, that everything was going to stop. Aeroplanes were going to fall out of the sky and so on, because the computer couldn't actually change. It can change a century change, but not a millennial change. Is those sort of things constant in the mind of younger people, or you just shrug that sort of thing off?
I don't know if many of us think about it too much. We do rely on computers, though, don't we? So if there is a cyber attack, what are we going to do? Are we going to go back to paper? Everybody will scramble for their details, for their information, trying to keep them safe. It's yeah, it's the last thing we'd need, I think, amongst everything else.
Stephen, your left hand is very active this evening, so you.
Yes, it's just reminding people which side of the political divide I stand. But so much is now done online. Barristers' offices are no longer being used. They all communicate online. Banks communicate online. Everything is online. And it has become more the case since lockdown. And we are, I think, not prepared for taking a step back and doing things the way we used to do them. We have grabbed this new future, and people are not thinking to how more practical and often more secure earlier ways were.
I think that's, you know, I'm always banging on about computers taking over mankind instead of mankind taking over computers. And I think it's a worry. I tried tapping into a recruiting agency online the other day, and after the 6th attempt to try and get to where I wanted to go, I gave up because of all this silly nonsense that they do. But there's nobody to talk to. Paul, it's all your fault because it's the financiers that started this thing.
Well, the financial markets control everything at the moment, don't they? And the English economy is really not well placed to deal with any of it at the moment.
Did I thrust a sword at you there, Paul?
You will see this, so no. Oh gosh, that's some very good points there. On the economic front, I do think that's a bit overstated. There's some cyber news says that Putin, the reason Putin's interested in the Baltic states, and I'm sure you know this, is that they have the highest experts in IT. And there's no doubt that Putin is probably considering some kind of cyber attack as an ancillary to whatever else he's got in mind. So I don't dismiss it out of the question. It's whether, I'm sure it'd just be everybody raising their game and, in other words, neutralizing, rather like when the ICBMs were launched. The idea is that 2 ICBMs, one from Washington and one from Moscow, I did this at uni, by the way, they would meet in the stratosphere and be neutralized. That's how the ICBM and the nuclear war was envisaged. In other words, it wouldn't be calamitous because each Washington knocks out New York. The actual missile is actually caught in the air. That's fact. But I don't dismiss the cyber threat. I just think it's got to be handled. But economically, I don't think we're in any worse position than anybody else. I do think that we've got the strongest economy other than Germany in the UK. That's done by GDP. So I'm not over worried. But yeah, I think Annie's point about what happens to the UK in any conflagration, who do we side with? Who are the good guys and the bad guys? That's the question.
Yeah, actually, it's very interesting you should say about the Baltic states and their in-depth technology basis, because I sat in the central bank in Lithuania about 7 or 8 years ago, and there were people demonstrating outside about losses of jobs and so on. And the central banker that was my host said, "We're about to join the euro, so nothing can happen to us." And then he brought out great books full of statistics and charts and so on to prove his point. I'm not sure that was very helpful. Right, we actually, believe it or not, have gone our 20-minute slot. We've got about a minute and a half left. So shall we take turns for a last word? And Mark, perhaps you'd like to have the final say, as it were.
Oh, thank you. I think that, listening to what Stephen was saying, I think that we do actually have quite a good resilience in this country. If we look at what's happening around the world and through Europe, they've all been very badly affected by the economic situation at the moment. I'm actually optimistic for this country. I think that we have some great systems, and I think we have great resilience, great innovators, and I think that we will be able to stand on our own 2 feet and move forward.
Any last word?
Great speech, Mark. Let's hope you're right.
Stephen?
Well, I thought we could all go riding on a rainbow to a new land far away, actually.
Paul?
I agree. I've got no worry about this country. As I say, if you look economically, we are the strongest in Europe and one of the strongest economies in the world, and that is undeniable. And I don't see that coronavirus will upset us up any differently from any other country. I'm very optimistic about this country. God save the Queen.
Oh, I disagree. Tell all that to the people who will have no jobs to go back to, Paul.
That's another discussion.
Next week, perhaps.
Right, we shall get into that discussion. Just for the moment, can I say that I think we should go back to steam trains, because in that era, the doors always opened. Thank you very much to the panel. Interesting discussion tonight. I don't think that we're too worried that war may break out, but there are some concerns about what's happening internationally, I think, in almost every sphere of our activity. Till next week, Keith Hayes and the panel. Good evening.
Bye now.
Bye.
Bye.